In the heart of Brentwood, just off South Mapleton Drive, sat a charming 1930s Spanish revival home, once owned by the late comedienne Gilda Radner. Nestled behind wrought-iron gates and shaded by old sycamore trees, the house had remained vacant for nearly a decade after her death in 1989. Though lovingly preserved, realtors whispered of buyers who pulled out suddenly, citing vague feelings, bad energy, they'd say. But none of that mattered to Heather and Jake Merriman, a young couple from Boston looking for a fresh start in LA after Jake landed a job editing comedy pilots for a streaming platform. They were drawn to the house's history. Of course, Gilda's name carried a kind of comforting legacy. Heather, a yoga instructor and amateur historian, loved the idea of breathing new life into an old space. "We thought it was perfect," she later said. "Sunny rooms, original floors, citrus trees in the yard. It was peaceful. At first. The first month was ordinary. Jake set up a home office where Gilda had reportedly written sketches. Heather filled the house with plants, lit candles, and repainted the kitchen in warm tones. But then came the small things, the motion sensor lights flicking on at night with no one outside. The sound of laughter, soft, faint, distinctly feminine, drifting through the hallway at 3 a.m. Jake would wake to find his laptop open to old NL skits he hadn't cued. Heather began hearing what she described as rehearsal murmurs, lines repeated under breath, as if someone were practicing. "It was always in Gilda's old dressing room. I didn't even know it was hers at the time." One night in October, as Heather was returning from the bathroom, she froze. Standing at the end of the hallway was a woman with short, curly hair in a 70s-style dress. She looked directly at Heather and smiled faintly before vanishing into the guest room. Heather screamed. Jake searched the house. No one. No signs of forced entry. But on the mirror in the guest room, drawn faintly in steam despite no one showering, were the words, "Don't forget to laugh." Determined to understand, Heather began researching Gilda's life in earnest. She learned that Radner had battled cancer while still trying to keep her humor alive. She even hosted small gatherings in the home during her final months. Friends said she would rehearse jokes for the hospital nurses. Heather reached out to one of Radner's surviving friends, an older actress who agreed to speak anonymously. When told of the events, the woman smiled sadly and said, that was her sanctuary. She used laughter to keep the dark away. If she's still there, it's not because she's angry, it's because she never finished her last act. Jake installed cameras after a night when all the radios in the house turned on at once, all tuned to static. The footage caught no intruder, but in the corner of the living room, where Gilda's piano used to be, a faint shadow would appear at 2:12 a.m. every night. It always looked like someone sitting, then standing, almost like bowing. They decided to host a small gathering, much like Gilda once did. Friends came over, they played music from the 70s, read her favorite sketches aloud, even did a few impersonations. That night, the house was warm again. The hallway lights no longer flickered, and the laughter, faint and sweet, returned only once, during a reading of one of her old characters. Jake said it best. It felt like she was saying thank you. Today, Heather and Jake still live there. They keep a photo of Gilda near the entryway and say hello every morning. The odd noise still happens, and sometimes, the old dressing room smells faintly of lilac and stage makeup, but the fear is gone. Only a sense of presence. Heather describes it as living with someone who never quite left the stage. Not a ghost to be feared, but a spirit who clung to joy, to comedy, to life. She isn't haunting us, Heather says with a soft smile. She's just not ready to leave the spotlight. The room they had originally designated as a guest bedroom began to take on a different character after that October night. Heather couldn't bring herself to sleep in there again, not out of fear, exactly, but something closer to reverence. It was the room where the woman had appeared, smiling in that fleeting, almost apologetic way, before vanishing into air that felt suddenly colder than the rest of the house. Jake didn't press the issue. He'd grown used to Heather's quiet rituals, saging corners of the room, lighting a candle near the dresser, whispering brief greetings to what she now only referred to as her. They didn't speak of Gilda often anymore, but she was always there, in the pauses between conversation, in the subtle shifts of air when laughter filled the home. Heather began calling the room the rehearsal room. Something about it no longer felt like it belonged to the ordinary rhythm of the house. It was separate. The window was always slightly ajar, even when they shut it. The curtains sometimes moved on their own, not dramatically, but as if someone had just brushed past them. Jake once stepped inside to grab an old extension cord and found the lamp in the corner switched on, its yellow glow casting a soft oval across the floor. He swore he'd unplugged it weeks before. On a cold Tuesday morning, Heather found a single sheet of paper on the small wooden desk they'd placed near the window. She was sure she'd left it bare. But now, resting in perfect alignment with the edge, was a page torn from an old legal pad. Faded ink, in surprisingly neat cursive, read, "Don't chase the laugh, just feel it." She stared at it for a long time, fingers hovering just above the surface, as though touching it might make it dissolve. 2 weeks later, Jake's parents flew in from Providence. It was their first time visiting LA, and Jake was eager to show off the house. They had brunch in the backyard under the lemon trees. His mother commented on how peaceful it felt, especially for a home with such Hollywood history. Heather smiled tightly, sipping her coffee. She still hadn't told anyone about the events in full. Some things, she felt, were meant to stay between her and the house. That night, Jake's father, an amateur photographer, snapped several pictures of the hallway with his vintage Leica. He liked to shoot film, said it captured real shadows. The following afternoon, while the others were out walking along San Vicente, he stayed back to review his negatives using a small backlit panel he brought with him. What he saw in one of the frames startled him enough to call Jake immediately. The photo, taken from the end of the hallway, showed Heather's silhouette walking into the kitchen. But behind her, just visible through the crack of the rehearsal room door, stood a faint figure. A woman, her face blurred, her hand lightly resting on the doorframe. It was hard to see unless you were looking, but once you saw it, you couldn't unsee it. Jake didn't show Heather the photo until days later. She studied it in silence, then calmly said she wanted to see the guests. By early December, Los Angeles was wet and gray with intermittent rain. The smell of damp earth rose up from the clay-tiled patio and filtered into the house through the old window frames. Heather took to spending more time in the living room, curled up with books or just staring out at the rain-soaked hedges. She had ordered an antique armchair from a consignment shop in Echo Park, a low, soft-back thing covered in faded plum-colored velvet. It arrived scuffed but charming, and she placed it in the corner near the fireplace, not far from where, legend had it, Gilda used to sit with friends on quiet Sunday evenings. The first time Heather sat in it, she felt a jolt. Not pain, more like a shift in pressure, a humming stillness. She sat very still for nearly 5 minutes, and in that time, her thoughts quieted in a way she couldn't explain. Felt like being watched but not judged. Listened to, almost. The room felt warmer. Outside, the wind knocked gently against the pane, but inside, the world was still. The next morning, she found a fresh daisy resting on the arm of the chair. Jake swore he didn't put it there. Neither of them had bought daisies. Just before New Year's, Jake was working late in the converted garage, editing a comedy pilot. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that allowed him to slip into a deep zone. Around midnight, as he was laying in a transition between scenes, he paused. There was a faint sound in the background of one of the audio clips. He isolated the track. It wasn't part of the actor's dialogue. It wasn't ambient sound. It was a laugh, but not a laugh from the set. It was recorded with strange clarity, slightly echoing, like it had been captured in a different room entirely. And it didn't match any of the actors' voices. It was feminine, joyful, familiar. Jake had watched countless old Gilda Radner performances in his life. He knew that laugh. When he played it back again, the software glitched momentarily, flashing the words, "track error, ghost input." He didn't tell Heather that night. He simply sat there in the dim glow of the screen, listening again and again, as the sound of laughter echoed softly through his headphones. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. January brought a cold front to Southern California, an unusual stretch of foggy mornings and crisp, silent nights. The house seemed to hold the chill in its bones, even with the central heat running. The windows remained fogged in the mornings, and more than once, Heather woke to find delicate shapes traced into the condensation. Not words, not exactly, more like doodles. Half faces, curved lines that looked like lips, or a teardrop, or an eye exaggerated in a way that made her think of caricature sketches. But what unsettled her most was the presence of a small X, drawn near the center of the hallway mirror. It appeared 3 mornings in a row. Always the same size, always at the same height. She wiped it off, but it came back soft and perfect, as if someone had traced it thoughtfully. Jake, meanwhile, had begun to dream of being on stage. In the dreams, he was always under hot lights, standing at a microphone, the audience lost in darkness. Sometimes he was wearing a 70s-era tuxedo. Sometimes he was barefoot. Always, just off stage left, stood a figure in shadow, a woman, short, curly hair, holding a notepad. She never spoke, but he knew it was her. The 4th night it happened. He woke in a sweat and whispered into the dark, "You can have the stage. I don't need it." That night the dream stopped, but the hallway mirror remained fogged, and the X never came back. The house, like many in Brentwood, had no traditional basement, but there was a crawl space accessible through a hatch in the laundry room floor. Jake had always intended to insulate it, maybe even turn it into a wine cellar. But for the most part, they left it alone. It smelled of dust and concrete, and the light bulb never worked, no matter how many times they replaced it. One Saturday afternoon, Heather was cleaning the laundry room when she noticed the hatch slightly ajar. She hadn't opened it. Jake hadn't either. Curious, and a little nervous, she pulled the door wide and retrieved a flashlight from the drawer. The beam cut through the dust and settled on something that hadn't been there before. A small cardboard box, tucked against the far wall. Inside was a single VHS tape. No label, only the word "tryout" written in faded blue marker on the side. They didn't even own a VCR. But Heather's friend Nina, a vintage collector, did. They brought the tape over that evening. The screen flickered to life, static rolling before cutting to a handheld shot of a living room, their living room, but decades earlier. The walls were lighter, and the furniture mid-century modern. In the center sat Gilda Radner. She was younger than in most photos Heather had seen, wearing a gray sweatshirt, hair pulled back, no makeup. She looked tired, but she smiled. For the next 20 minutes, Gilda performed solo sketches to an invisible camera crew. Jokes about hospitals, about cancer, about losing your hair and trying to flirt anyway. It wasn't polished, it was raw, intimate. She stumbled on words, paused to laugh at herself, even broke down crying once before shaking it off with a joke about mascara that wasn't there. Jake sat frozen. Heather clutched a pillow. At the end, Gilda looked into the camera. Her voice was hoarse, but clear. "If no one ever sees this, that's okay. But if someone does remember, it's okay to laugh at the hard stuff. That's the only reason I'm still here." The screen went black. Heather cried the whole drive home. One corner of the house had always had strange acoustics. A small alcove off the main hallway, just big enough for a reading chair and a side table. They tried turning it into a quiet nook, then a record corner, then nothing at all. Something about it refused to settle. One night, while Jake was out, Heather lit a single candle in the alcove and sat in silence. The house was still, but the air had weight to it, like just before a thunderstorm. She closed her eyes and leaned back. And then, very faintly, she heard it. Not from the hallway, not from outside, from the walls. Laughter. Not malicious, not mocking, gentle, and layered like a small room full of people laughing softly, maybe at an inside joke. She opened her eyes. The candle hadn't flickered. She whispered, "Is this where you practiced?" The laughter faded. But then, somewhere deeper in the house, a radio turned on. One of the old ones they never used. An antique Jake had bought from a flea market, playing a grainy rendition of "I Will Survive." Heather stood slowly. She walked the hallway like she was moving through someone else's memory. When she reached the living room, the radio stopped. In the silence that followed, she smiled. By mid-February, Heather had started writing again. Not a memoir, not exactly. More like sketches. Observations. She called it house notes. It began with a few pages descriptions of mornings, dreams, sounds she couldn't explain. But the more she wrote, the more the house responded. Sometimes she'd leave the notebook in the rehearsal room, only to find a new line written below hers, always in the same neat cursive. Heather, the room feels full today. Like someone's waiting. Response, try the punchline before the setup. Heather, the radio came on again. Gilda, was that you? Response, only on Tuesdays. The handwriting wasn't hers. And Jake had no idea what she was talking about when she asked him about the notes. Some pages were missing by the next week. But in their place, taped to the wall above the desk, was an old photograph. Black and white, slightly water-damaged. It showed a woman in profile, sitting at a vanity table, smiling. Gilda, alone, lit by a single bulb overhead. In the bottom right corner, someone had scribbled, "Curtains up." March arrived with a rare and torrential Los Angeles rainstorm. For 2 days, the streets around Brentwood flooded with runoff, and palm trees bent under the weight of sideways wind. Power lines flickered and cut, and the old Spanish Revival house fell into darkness just before sunset on the second night. Jake lit candles and brought the fireplace to life. Heather stood in the kitchen, watching droplets slide down the glass like slow tears. The house was unusually quiet. No static radios, no laughter, no whispers from the walls. It was the first time in months that Heather felt alone inside it. But not unwatched. That night, they ate dinner on the floor, bundled in blankets. Heather pulled the house notes notebook from under the couch and opened to a blank page. "I think she's gone," she said quietly. "I think maybe we did what she needed." Jake looked up from the fire. "Or maybe we just made space for her to leave." Heather nodded. Then, for no clear reason, she flipped to the very last page of the notebook, a page she hadn't written on yet. There, in the same neat cursive, one final line had appeared. "Thank you for letting me rehearse." Heather didn't cry. She smiled, gently closing the book and setting it on the hearth, just beside the fireplace where the flames threw soft shadows against the brick. A gust of wind rattled the glass panes, and somewhere inside the house, a floorboard creaked, not heavy, not sharp, just familiar. Months passed. Spring warmed the city, and the jacaranda trees bloomed purple across the winding Brentwood streets. Life took on a rhythm again. Jake's work stabilized. Heather began hosting small meditation sessions in the garden. They no longer spoke aloud to the house. There was no need, until the day Vanity Fair called. A journalist named Amanda Levine had tracked down records of former celebrity estates, working on a piece about the secret histories of homes once owned by comedic legends. She asked if they'd be willing to talk about living in Gilda Radner's old place. Heather hesitated, but something inside her, some leftover warmth from those long, haunted nights, said yes. Amanda arrived with a camera crew and a voice recorder. They toured the home, stopping at the rehearsal room, where Heather had preserved the space almost exactly as it had been. She'd even hung the old photograph they'd found, the one of Gilda, at her vanity above the desk. When Amanda asked if they'd experienced anything strange, Heather said, "We did, but not frightening. It felt like someone who hadn't finished saying goodbye." Amanda raised a brow. "You think Gilda was here?" Jake spoke softly from across the room. "I don't think she ever really left. I think she was waiting for someone to remember her, not as a star or a tragedy, but as a person who still wanted to make people laugh. Even if it was just a whisper in the hallway." Amanda nodded, and the interview continued. But after the crew packed up and left, Jake found a small white envelope tucked behind the living room mirror. There was no address, no postage. Inside was a single sheet of old paper, a script page, a comedy sketch. The lines were sharp, funny, unfinished. And at the bottom, "If you're reading this, punch up the second act. Signed G." Years passed. The house grew quiet in a new way, not because it was empty, but because it no longer needed to speak. Heather eventually published House Notes as a short memoir. It never became a bestseller, but among certain circles, especially in old comedy clubs and dusty green rooms. It passed hand to hand like a secret. In one chapter, she wrote, "She never asked us to fix the house, only to notice it, to hear it, to laugh when the lights flickered and not to run from the echoes. I think we were the last audience she needed." Today, the chair still sits by the fireplace. The daisy, long wilted, is pressed inside the pages of the notebook. The radio hasn't turned on by itself in years. But once, on a quiet Sunday afternoon, Heather returned from the garden and found the mirror in the rehearsal room fogged. At the center of it, a smiley face, drawn in a single graceful line. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.